So welcome everyone, great to see you all here. I'm Trisha Carter, I'm the Executive Secretary for Families and Global Transition, and I'm here with Danau Tanu, who is the co-leader of the Research Network affiliate. Dr. Danau Tanu is an Honorary Research Fellow at the School of Social Sciences of the University of Western Australia. She's a TCK who has lived experience of international schooling and has conducted extensive research into the topic. She has written the book, Growing Up in Transit, The Politics of Belonging at an International School. Welcome to Danau, great to have you here.
Thank you, really good to be here. Some of my friends and I had been talking about these kinds of issues from before BLM had happened, and we found that the easiest way to broach difficult topics is to talk about our own privileges first. So I wanted to start by talking about my privilege. And in fact, I've got more privileges than not. My premise is that we all have racial biases, and we are all in some ways blind to our own privileges and the impact that it has on others. And sometimes we do things that we don't intend to because we can't see the blind spots. And for myself, I've had friends, families call me out and said, you know, that's a little bit racist. And I'm like, oh, which part? And then they'll explain, I'm like, yeah, I guess it is. And, you know, just say sorry, move on, fix it, change what's in my heart. That's sort of my approach to this. And so in my case, even among third culture kids, you know, speaking English as my first language, that's a huge, huge privilege. And having this kind of accent that makes me sound like I've been educated in English all my life, having a university degree, socioeconomically, I'm probably part of the 1%. And also, you know, I'm not white, but I am East Asian, which means I'm light-skinned. And that accords me a lot of privileges. And being Japanese, my mother's Japanese, my father's Indonesian of Chinese background. You know, being Japanese because Japan had colonized many parts of Asia, that sort of historically gives Japanese and the Japanese language a sort of status. That's a privilege that I've got as well. Able-bodied, cisgendered, et cetera, et cetera. But where I don't have privilege is probably being a woman, you know, in the sexism sort of hierarchy, not being white. And while I speak English now, I don't come from an English-speaking family. I don't come from a westernized family. And so for me, this mattered as a kid going to an international school. I think the issue with international schools is that, you know, there's a problem, but the problem is that a lot of us don't recognize that there's a problem. And that's sort of where we get to start, because I think international schools are so used to feeling like, you know, we're so international, patting ourselves on the back on what a great job we're doing. You know, there's not a problem compared to back home. You know, back home, you're American, maybe it's like, you know, the Black kids and the white kids and the Asian kids, they didn't hang out together, but in the international schools, they do. And so what's the problem? Oh, you know, except for the problem is like, you know, the Korean kids and the Indonesian, the local kids, you know, they kind of don't integrate, but otherwise everybody else is a third culture kid. And there's a sense of like a blindness about what we're doing. But the thing is, as long as we live in this world, there's no way, I feel, there's no way we can escape these racial biases. There's no way we can be immune to it in terms of absorbing and internalizing them. And so that's sort of what we want to talk about today, what I'd like to talk about today. And so I find that a lot of teachers don't know these issues exist, but a lot of students do. They notice it. Teachers of color do, and I've spoken to a couple of teachers of color. You know, a lot of them, they want to talk about it, but they're afraid. They're afraid of repercussions, of losing their jobs, because the leadership doesn't see it. So, you know, what is the actual problem? You know, what are the students saying? And then talk about how the structure, you know, how do we contribute, those working in the international school communities, how do we contribute to this problem? And then what can we do about it? Trisha is going to help us a bit more about that.
So we're now going to have a bit of a think about looking at the school, you know, from the eyes of the students and thinking about the way structural racism shows up in international schools.
Often the conversation is, you know, the dominant narrative is that, you know, international schools is a home for TCKs. This is where they may feel most comfortable, but that's not always true. It depends on what your family background is. So for example, for me, being Asian at, you know, at home, like mom's Japanese, dad's Indonesian, Chinese. We speak English, but not very much. It's mostly, I didn't learn English at home by day. I have to conform to certain cultural norms by day. And then when I come home, I'm Asian. And that sort of dissonance, I remember, but as a kid, it's confusing because you don't understand culture and you see the differences and you see like the American teacher and the American students having this sort of special bond or connection that I'm not a part of, but then like I don't quite know why that is. Because as you know, when you're 5, 6, 7, you don't really understand culture. As an adult, you do. It's like, oh yeah, we're different. But as a kid, you don't. And it's like, why am I not part of this? What happens for a lot of kids, and you know, a lot of the students that I researched, interviewed, was that they end up shedding their home culture, shedding their language. And now I'm meeting a lot of third culture kids who are adults and saying, you know, I can't speak in my parents' language properly, or, you know, I have to use a dictionary to talk to my parents. The pressure of wanting to, you know, having to speak English. And also, not just because it's spoken in the school, and sometimes, you know, it's not like the teachers are saying don't speak in your home language, but this hierarchy, the superiority of English that it exists in the world. Kids feel that. And this can affect their relationship with their parents. As I said, you know, some of them use dictionaries to talk to their parents. And so one of the alumni that I had interviewed, she said, Leanne, so she's, you know, her father's Singaporean, mom's Indonesian, and she spoke Indonesian before she went to school. And then once she started to go into school, she learned English. And she says, you know, once I started learning English, I was like, I felt smart. And going to this school, she says, you know, all of a sudden you're like on a pedestal, and I'm quoting her here. There was a feeling of superiority, definitely, because of the affiliation with the school, you know, with the expat lives. A primary school kid can use this language to kind of subvert that power relation with their parents. And that's how powerful English is. And so we call that internalized racism, where you internalize the racist structures that you learn from society, and then you use it against your own parents, your own people, or sometimes you use it against yourself, you know. But then there are other kids who come to the international school system from a non-English speaking background when they're a bit older. One of the ones I interviewed, he said, you know, when he came in his senior year, so he couldn't speak English prior to that. And he said, you know, for the first 3 months, I had nightmares every night about coming to school. That's how terrified he was about being in this English speaking environment. And it's not just because it's a language that he can't speak. It's because it's a language that he can't speak, that he perceives, or the world perceives, as superior. And that's where the fear comes from. And then another student that, you know, the kids, you know, who's quote unquote self-segregate are not trying to integrate. But what I found in my interviews is that they've all tried. They said, when I first came to the school, I tried to integrate. I tried to talk to all the, you know, English speaking kids, but it's like they're not interested. I talk to a Korean kid and ask about homework, and I'm new. You know, they tell me about the homework, and then they'll also ask, you know, oh, who's your teacher? And then the conversation would naturally expand. But she says, when I try to talk to the English speaking kids, if I ask about homework, they'll answer. They're not rude. They'll answer, but they're not interested in expanding the conversation. And so the conversation would end. And so she said, you know, I tried, I just couldn't. So now I hang out with the Korean kids. So that's from the perspective of those who have tried but aren't able to integrate. But even when I interviewed like the student council leaders, you know, other students who are in the English speaking groups, some of them are aware. So even students who are from the school approved, you know, the ones that the teachers think are the ideal students, some of them, not all of them, most of them don't, but some of them do notice that there's this lack of interest on the part of their friends and, you know, the ones who are quote unquote self-segregating. And so what my point is that you know, often these kids get accused of self-segregating, but actually integration is a two-way street. The kids who don't speak English as a first language, in the mainstream classes, they're dead quiet. They're just like nervous. You can tell they're nervous. They're just looking at their notebook. and they just don't participate in the conversations. And so the teachers think, the Japanese, the Koreans, they just, that's how they are in class. But when I see those same students who say absolutely nothing in the mainstream classes, when I see them in their home language classes, like Japanese class or Indonesian class, whatever, they're like bouncing off the wall, talking, chatting, laughing, talking to the teacher, joking with the teacher. It's like their personalities completely change. And I don't think the school leaders and the teachers from the dominant culture understand this or notice this. Or in elementary school, everybody's friends with everybody. And so I've seen research, PhD researchers who say, third culture kids, race doesn't matter anymore, it's problem solved, because they had studied the elementary school kids. But these students said, but then when you get to middle school, it's sort of like there's this vague grouping between Westernized Westerners and Westernized Asians and the Asians. And then by the time you get to high school, they then just segregate a bit more into, and I'm using the word segregate, but language groups become more prominent. When you're a kid, you're still socializing, you're still training to become a social being. And as long as you can do an activity together, go play soccer or go play whatever, then that's what matters, right? It's not the whole talking and conversing and getting to know each other. And so that's part of the identity development stages. But as you grow up, you want to see other people mirror who you are, and you learn who you are by how others see you. And that's how you become a social being. My Korean parent goes to the Korean club and meets all these other Korean parents, then I'm obviously going to have more opportunities to meet other Korean kids, right? And same with the American kids, if they go to the American club again. And that's really invisible in the school, but that influences who they befriend. Just thought of a TED Talk that is really good. Saiko Mizuta, she's tutoring Japanese English bilinguals, and she says that research says, even if a kid sounds fluent, to use a new language academically, she said it takes about 5 to 7 years before you're actually able to do that fluently. And international schools are starting to making sure the kids get support in the home language. This is how long it takes to learn a new language. Why is there so much pressure for Korean kids to become Westernized, or anyone else? I'm saying I'm studying third culture kids, and teachers are excited. It's like, oh, that's awesome. Everyone's a third culture kid here, except maybe the Koreans and the Indonesian kids. And I'm like, and I heard this a few times, and I'm like, I wonder, I want to study real third culture kids. So I wonder why they think the Koreans aren't third culture kids. And then I started talking to them, and I'm like, I don't get it. Like, you've got the Korean kid who's left Korea when he was 3, moved around several countries, and now he's here. He's a third culture kid. It was like the teachers thought, you're not a third culture kid unless you're in that ideal, what they see as the ideal student groups. So that's one way the teachers contribute to this. Most of them don't talk about it all that much, but they act as gatekeepers. So the international school was in Indonesia, and I think this is across the world, where the local students get accused of not integrating as well. And so in this case, it was the Indonesian. So I went and hung out with Indonesian kids. And it turns out the Indonesian group is not Indonesian. Like, it's majority Indonesian, yes, but there's like 3 Korean kids, 2 Taiwanese kids, and a couple of Indian kids, and then there was a Filipino kid, and just a whole lot of mix. And not all of them spoke proper Indonesian. Why does one group get seen as ideal and the others don't? And I think my theory is that because a lot of teachers are coming from a background where race is the main measure of diversity. In America, we don't see the Black and the Asians and Black kids hanging out together. So we come to the international school and they are hanging out together. It's like, wow, this is really international. But what they don't realize is that the kids who are motley colored and hanging out with each other, you've got the white American kid, the African American kid, the Indian American kid, and the Pakistani American kid hanging out with each other. Racially, they're diverse, but culturally, they all know how to operate in this westernized way. So the racial aspect kind of masks the fact that culturally they're all very similar, or all of them know how to operate in this westernized culture, even if at home they're not operating in it. Teachers, sometimes they don't model it for their students. So they would, I had teachers come up to me and go, Danau, how can we get these students to integrate? But then the same teacher, we were supposed to meet up for lunch, and like, where should we meet? In the staff lunchroom, where, the food is cheap and it's really good and it's air conditioned. He's like, no, let's go to the student cafeteria. And I'm like, okay, why? You seem like you didn't really want to go there. He's like, yeah, because like a lot of the Indonesian staff hang out there and they're always speaking Indonesian. And so I just don't feel comfortable. And then another teacher's like, oh, I know how you feel into the dominant culture of the schools. And it's not like they don't speak English, right? These are all staff at the school. And this is the whole idea of the hidden curriculum. It's what we say we teach, which I believe we believe in, but by the very makeup of the institution, we are teaching this hidden agenda. It's not like anybody's setting out to try to teach it, but it's being taught because it's our daily experience here. And the multiculturalism and all those aspects that are powerful and good. But there is this dark underbelly that isn't being addressed here. And I think it poisons the system to some degree. If we can tell the parents, look, this is what happens. If you send your kids to these schools, have a school that appreciates the home language. If we know what the impact this has on the kids in terms of language, in terms of well-being, in terms of self-esteem, etc., I think the schools can use that to say, parents, this is kind of important. But the other issue is, at the moment, a lot of schools, they just kind of blame it on the parents. It's like, well, the parents are racist. We're not racist, but the parents are. And that sort of, again, blinds them to what actually happens in the schools, the structural issues that happens in the schools. So there are those sorts of biases where it's that lack of interest. And this is like very subtle. They don't have the quote unquote cultural capital to operate in this sort of more accepted way. So there are those biases. And I think you can also probably see it in terms of who gets to be the teacher's pet. Just to recognize that this happens and to be aware of it, I think would help teachers. And also in terms of awards and stuff, I did notice that with the, sports being emphasized more, and, the Korean students would say, oh, I guess the school doesn't like us because we study too much and we don't really contribute to the school. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Because they're all in the orchestra, they're in the band, they're in the strings, contributing, but it's not seen because it's music and not sports. So biases work in that kind of way.
I think you began with saying there's no way that we can escape bias. And sometimes when we unpack it, we can actually feel a bit overwhelmed by the fact that we have biases and that they keep on reappearing. And so this conversation can take us down a rather painful and sometimes a sense of hopelessness, and we don't want it to do that. And so that's why we wanted to spend a little bit of time thinking from more of a strengths-focused, solutions-focused perspective. Right now, I just want you to think about you yourself as an individual or a community that you've been a part of, and a major transition that you've faced, and one that you went through and you've come out to a new place in life. What was it that enabled you to work through that? What were the practices and the strengths that you drew on to enable you to get through that time? One of the things that research shows us, when we're sitting in a strengths-based perspective, we are able to think more creatively. We come up with more solutions. So if we can hold on to whatever it was that you held in your heart about your strengths in those difficult times. And now if we want to think about some more things that we could do. So, whatever it might be that you want to see being done differently, and that you have an idea that you want to put your energy towards. Jane Barron isn't here, but I'm sure she wouldn't mind me quoting. She talks about how emotional stability is the shelf on which the cognitive glassware sits. And so if we don't have the emotional strength built into the children, then there's no way that their cognitive learning is going to take place. Whew. And I guess I just want to encourage the conversations, the stories, making these conversations common, and recognize our own biases. Most of all today, I want to thank all of you for coming. And I especially and heartfeltly want to thank Danau.
Thank you so much, everyone. To end on a positive note, the reason we're all talking about this is because we have been educated to think critically. And so this is a positive result of our education in the international schools.